Josh Wolfe, co-founder of Lux Capital. Thank you so much for joining us here. Bloomberg at the Hill and Valley event. Everyone from Silicon Valley, the administration, elected officials all are here. And the focus seems to be about AI and China. You recently talked about how DeepSeek was really a wake-up call for the United States. How do you think the U.S. is approaching this entire problem of China and how advanced they are when they come to AI?
Well, the first thing starts with the chips. So we said, okay, we have to restrict chips onto China. And unfortunately, one of the great lessons of innovation is that necessity is the mother of invention. So we restrict them. They're still going to find ways to route around. Now, whether DeepSeek was trained through, in a technical term, these diffusion models where they sort of copied some of the other foundation models and built on them doesn't matter. What matters is really efficiently on presumably less GPUs, meaning they don't need as many chips, they were able to do things that some of our best models couldn't do. And so that was a wake-up call to say, is the future of AI going to be smaller models? Is the future of AI going to be different chip architecture? And how are we going to compete on that? Now, my own personal view is that open source is going to beat closed source, that these large companies, OpenAI, Anthropic, and others that have raised tens of billions of dollars, most of which have accrued to Jensen and NVIDIA because he sells the chips, that in the future, what's going to happen is the companies that have the longitudinal silos of data, meaning people that have a lot of big data, which everybody was talking about 10 years ago, didn't materialize to a lot, are the ones that will be able to use free open source models on their proprietary data. So that might be pharma companies with their clinical trial data, it might be Bloomberg with their repository of financial information, it might be Meta with their WhatsApp chats and Instagram and Facebook posts, it might be Elon and Tesla and X with all the Twitter posts. So those are the people that I think are going to be advantaged, and that's what we should be focusing on. How do we compete with China? Not on the chip side, not on the model side, but on the applications and the use of the data to actually do stuff.
On the chip side, though, Jensen Huang, I caught up with him very quickly when he was coming into the conference, and I asked him about how far behind is China, and he said, is China behind? He thinks they're very, very close.
Yes.
So how do we make sure that they don't surpass America?
Well, I think it's going to be about the use cases. So number one, we don't want the rest of the world using Chinese models because Chinese models will approach an asymptote of truth, but not truth. There will be no search about Tiananmen Square and Xinjiang and the Uyghurs and these kinds of things. And so we want the world using open models that are made by companies like ours, like Hugging Face, that are the open source repository for all the best AI models. That to me is something that trends closer to truth, and those are the kinds of systems that you want people using AI for. They're going to come up with their own chip systems. They're going to come up with less good, but much more numerous of them, and they're going to find ways to beat us in that domain. They're going to come up with their own models, again, tuned to their own policy prescriptions and what Xi Jinping wants. The key is how do we get our kids using it early? How do we become advantaged as individual humans using AI to be more productive?
Do you like what you're seeing so far this administration when it comes to AI?
Well, I like that there's a future-forward competitive stance. I like that they are embracing and not demonizing tech and big tech. I do think that we have to celebrate our entrepreneurs. I do think we have to celebrate our scientists. And that to me is a really important thing.
The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said to me a few weeks ago that NASDAQ, when it was in free fall, had a MAG 7 problem, and he was talking about DeepSeek and the peak.
Not a MAGA
problem. Do you agree with him?
Well, that's a bigger market question on the concentration in some of the top names and even the structure of the market between passive indexation and active. But I do think that a lot of people are basically in, Meta and Apple and Amazon and Netflix and Microsoft and Google and NVIDIA. And I do think that you're pining to see an emergence of new companies. If you look in aerospace and defense, the demand for Anduril, one of our companies in aerospace and defense that's here, Brian Schimpf and Palmer Luckey. Brian's here and just spoke earlier, did an amazing job with National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. The demand for their most recent round was 4x. They raised $2.5 billion, 4x what people could actually invest. So people are pining for a new generation of high-tech, aerospace defense, AI-centric companies, and I think over the next 1 or 2 years, we're going to see those companies at a point of maturity where they go IPO and the demand is there.
I also want to talk about trade because that's the biggest topic in the room when it comes to China. It's not just AI in this race, literally competing with China on every level, and now the president wants it to be also on a manufacturing level. They say these rates are unsustainable. Do you agree? Do these tariff rates have to come down, or does America lose a tremendous amount of competitiveness from the business perspective?
Well, either. this was the worst policy rollout ever and the greatest policy ever in history. Or, and I'm going to give a generous interpretation, it's part of a grand bargain. And the grand bargain may be not just trade and tariffs and exchanges and correcting the imbalances, not only of them sending us cheap goods and buying our treasuries, large holders, along with Japan, but maybe you end up with a grand bargain where you've got TikTok on the table, you've got fentanyl on the table, you've got IP theft and security on the table, some human rights issues, maybe some environmental issues, freedom of navigation, clarification around the South China Sea. So I think that there's going to be a grand bargain. I will say that the number one thing that happened since this first 100 days was a lot of volatility and a lot of surprise. I was not surprised by the surprise. I don't think you were either, because the one thing we knew from Trump 1.0 was that there was going to be a lot of unpredictability and surprise. If you were a country coming to the table today and thinking about negotiating with Scott Bessent, who's a friend, and I love him, I think he's one of the great adults in the room, you are thinking, will I pay a premium to have stability and predictability for my economy and my people? And I think the answer is probably yes. If you get Japan, if you get South Korea, if you get Germany, all of a sudden you've got and India, you've got 4 of the major countries in the world. China will probably take a year or two, and I think Scott himself has said that.
If it takes a year or two, can we live with 145% tariffs? I spoke to the CEO of Flexport earlier today who says this means small businesses are going to go bankrupt.
I do think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on people, and they're going to be clamoring to figure out alternatives. I don't think that this move of let's put up tariffs so that we can reshore is going to be a near-term solution. That's why you're seeing the shock. Can we friendshore across a whole variety of countries? I think the answer is yes.
Wow. So when it comes to this grand bargain, is there a red line for you, something the U.S. should not concede?
In policy or in?
In policy with China?
Oh, I mean, to me, the biggest thing, honestly, I think at the moment is VCs like us should not be investing in technology companies in China that are effectively part of this military-civil fusion of the Chinese Communist Party.
So almost a control on capital leaving the United States. You think it should be a ban?
I do not believe, and this is something I testified in front of Congress a year or two ago. And
At the China Select Committee, right?
Correct. And I said, look, it's one thing to have the Belt and Road policy. It's another thing to buy the belt and then let them put it around your neck. So we have to be really thoughtful about the technologies, including TikTok, including other things that could turn into weapon systems or be used against us. And so that part of what the administration is doing and realigning, not, again, as Scott says, America first doesn't mean America alone. Doesn't mean us, not making friends with our allies and shoring that up. But I do think there's a lot of threats from China that are more insidious than people understand.
Finally, I want to get your thoughts on some of the research cuts we've seen from the Trump administration. Do you think this is going to have lasting damage when it comes to new businesses or new drug treatments, potentially basically cutting off where this incredible new ideas in America start from? It's
very possible. I do think that there's a constructive outcome that could come from this. But the way that it works is our taxpayer dollars go into the government. Government goes to the 3-letter agencies like the NSF, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. They then dole it out to the universities and to the researchers in a variety of departments from chemistry and physics and material science. The universities then, because of something called the Bayh-Dole Act, can spin that out into a patent, spin it out to a company, and we get to license it as intellectual property. It's one of the main parts of the ecosystem for creating new companies, from Google to Microsoft to Genentech. And so much great drugs and innovation has been unleashed, and so much wealth has been created and jobs have been created. So to attack that, I think, is unwise. But I do think that there's an opportunity. At Lux, for 20 plus years, we've been going to universities, going to government labs, finding the best and the brightest principal investigators, these brilliant scientists, taking their work, licensing it into new companies, capitalizing with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and bringing them to market. We're more excited than ever to do that. And it's sort of like a siren call for a lot of these scientists. If you're ready to be commercialized, and maybe before it was 80% baked, and maybe now it's 70% or 60% baked, we are ready to take that scientific risk to capitalize your company and take that scientific work and let it continue so it doesn't fall off a funding cliff.
Josh Wolfe, very thoughtful. Thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate it.